Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out on this blustery day here. A couple of quick housekeeping things from our wonderful festival organizers. Before we begin, they'd like me to let you know that books by the authors in the program can be purchased from the Center for Fiction here in the church, in the back, I believe, where the authors will also be signing. So at the conclusion of the program, please go directly to your signing tables. And at the conclusion of the program, we ask the audience to leave their seats so the next audience can be seated. Okay, so let me introduce our two wonderful panelists here. Bill McKibben, to my left, is the author of more than a dozen books, including the bestsellers Falter, Deep Economy, and The End of Nature. He's the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College, the founder of 350.org, and the winner of the Gandhi Prize, the Thomas Merton Prize, and the Right Livelihood Prize. His new project, Organizing People Over 60 for Progressive Change, is called Third Act, and his latest book is The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. Olúfẹ Táíwò, to my right, is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University. He's the author of Elite Capture, How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else, and Reconsidering Reparations, both published earlier this year. Táíwò's theoretical work draws liberally from the Black radical tradition, contemporary social science, and histories of activism and activist thinkers. His public philosophy, including articles exploring intersections of climate justice and colonialism, has appeared in The New Yorker, The Guardian, The New Republic, Foreign Affairs, Boston Review, and many other outlets. So if you could just give us a round of applause for our authors. Excellent. So I think it's fair to say that much of... yourself, too. Oh, my name is Ishan Desai-Geller. I'll be the moderator for this panel. I work as an assistant editor at the New Press, and I'm delighted to be here. So thank you. That was a good, helpful reminder. So I think it's fair to say that much of what we're here to discuss today falls under the rubric of crisis in one way or another. So I'd like to set the stage with a few questions that kind of draw out your respective diagnoses of our current predicament, or predicaments, and then that give us a sense of how you came to the political questions that animate your work. And from there, I'd like to turn to the thorny but perennial question of what is to be done. Sorry in advance for that. So it strikes me that both of your books draw on rich and varied archives, covering everything from memoir to the philosophy of language, investigative journalism, to the political philosophy of the Black radical tradition, all of which gives the reader clues to the experiences, the histories, the intellectual traditions that inform your political orientations. So Femi, could you tell us a bit about the concept of elite capture, what it is, how it comes to bear on our politics, but also what, in your view, makes elite capture a particularly valuable lens through which to understand the political problems that you're setting out to address?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Thanks everybody for braving the weather to come here. I've been thinking a lot about how to explain the concept of elite capture. You write a thing and you think you have it. And then people say back to you what you think you said, and you're like, let me try again. All right, so think about inequality, regular old inequality. I think we all understand that. It's a concept we use a lot in mainstream media. And usually when people talk about inequality, they are talking about resources that you could count. So how much wealth do the rich people have? Or how many acres of land do the rich people own versus everybody else? And if we were thinking about that kind of inequality, we could just measure it, right? So we could have a society where the top 1% owns 10% of the land, or we could have a society where the top 1% of people own 50% of the land. And the second one would be a more unequal society. All I mean by elite capture is the practical version of that, right? How much control do the most advantaged people have over the stuff that we do rather than the resources that we do stuff with? So there are a few examples of this. I think the one clear version is the political agenda, right? Are the things we're fighting for in our organizations reflective of the problems that all marginalized people have in the group, or reflective of the problems that the most advantaged people in a marginalized group have. So this is an allegation that has been leveled at the LGBTQ movement, that some people feel like marriage equality was something that reflected the priorities of more advantaged people, like white cis gay men, as opposed to workplace discrimination or homelessness, which might have reflected the problems of queer people who are worse off and maybe more representative of the whole group. So there's resource inequality and there's practical inequality. Practical inequality is elite capture. And the reason I started talking about elite capture is just because there's a lot of stuff being said about identity politics, especially on the political left, that makes it sound like identity politics has some special problem, right? That it's in identity politics that the most advantaged people end up in control of political agendas or of the aid dollars or nonprofit dollars that go to an issue or whatever the resources we might have in mind are. But what I was trying to say in the book Elite Capture is it isn't a special problem. That is just politics under conditions of inequality. And if we have a problem with that, then we need to do some more fundamental challenging of our political structure rather than singling out identity politics.
Thanks so much. Bill, I have a kind of similar question for you. I mean, your book, or one of the stories that your book tells, is the ascension of the white suburban middle and upper middle class in the United States, its high water mark, in the 70s, and ultimately the destruction, both domestic and global, cultural and material, that it left in its wake. So again, could you tell us what it is about this particular story that tells us something useful about the political problems which you set out to tackle in the book?
Sure. So first of all, many thanks for having us here, and what a pleasure to be here. I have a feeling that I should probably stop coming to New York, a city I love. The last time I was here a year ago was when the remnants of Hurricane Ida came over and dropped the biggest rainstorm in New York City history. And I got in today just in time for what appeared to be a hurricane coming through the center of Brooklyn. I have a bad feeling it's just a cloud that I drag around with me as a result of my work. So I apologize and will flee quickly. And it's really good to get to be here. Let me just say at the beginning that I really enjoyed Femi's book, and it's really smart, and it also has the great and underappreciated virtue of being short, not something that progressive political discourse is, so concision is an extraordinary gift. Look, this book of mine is as close to a memoir as I'll ever write. It's not really much of a memoir, but it's about the world that I grew up in and perhaps there's one or two people my age here today, growing up in the era of the 60s and the 70s. And it started with just a reflection of how strange at times the world we live in now seems to me, that it did not turn out in the ways that I would have expected. I've spent my life working on climate issues, and the fact that it took 34 years between the day that Jim Hansen testified about global warming before Congress and Congress acted seems to me finally passed something this summer, not something great, but something. That's bizarre to me because I was around for the first Earth Day when 20 million Americans took to the streets, and when a year later a Republican president created the Environmental Protection Agency and signed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, And it also would not have occurred to me to think, though I lived at an early age through Watergate and the associated traumas, that we would end up in a country where thousands of our countrymen were storming the Capitol and killing police officers in an effort to stop the counting of votes. So I was, for me, the kind of curious puzzle was to more clearly situate where we made some kind of fateful turns. And I'm convinced that that decade of the 70s, which began, though, with plenty of traumas, assassinations, the war, Watergate, we were still at some level embarked on the national project that we'd come out of the Depression and the Second World War, fighting the desire to build together some kind of better community, what LBJ called the Great Society, what Dr. King called the beloved community, and by decade's end had decided quite firmly as a country that that's not what we were interested in, that we wanted a country where market forces would predominate, where government was the problem, not the solution. And figuring out kind of why we made that set of decisions and if they were absolutely fated or not, I guess was the project, but this makes it sound like a somewhat more systematic attempt at political philosophy than it really is, and I don't want to disappoint anybody either. It's in some ways just the story of what it felt like to be growing up in suburban America at a time when that, at least in its beginning, modest approach to some kind of mass prosperity seemed likely to sort of spread instead of the kind of dysfunctional, unbelievably unequal society that we've managed to build now.
So Femi, the opening vignette of Elite Capture describes how even as public life ground to a halt during the early pandemic lockdowns of 2020, police violence persisted, not just domestically but globally. And you note too, and I think this is a significant thing to underscore, that the popular response was equally global in scope. You write, quote, "Despite differences in local context, when people around the world rose up against the police terror and violence to which they'd been subjected for hundreds of years, it was immediately clear that something global was at stake." So needless to say, climate crisis, what you term global racial empire, is also a political problem on a planetary scale. So I wanted to ask, what does it mean for something global to be at stake in our political struggles? And what sorts of opportunities for resistance does that open? And then conversely, what challenges does that pose to effective political action?
Yeah, I think this is an important question. And it's helpful that Bill gave the answer he did just now, and in general has been working on trying to link what's happening now to the 70s and the political changes that happened around then. Because what was also happening in the 70s and the 60s was one of the greatest political changes of the past few centuries. This is a global anti-colonial movement. Before the Second World War, a quarter of the landmass of the world and a quarter of the population of the world was under the imperial control of the British Empire alone, right? Like, this is taken together. Colonialism was the international political structure of the world, and largely as a result of the decades-long work of anti-colonial movements and the political opening caused by the Second World War, there were huge movements throughout Asia and Africa for national independence, and a lot of them got going and won independence in the 60s and the 70s. And part of the political response to this movement throughout the world, outside of Europe and the United States, was something that helped along the radical movement that was in the United States and, of course, Europe as well. So a lot of activists in the US in those decades, identified themselves as third world or in solidarity with the third world. And it was among the elements of radical politics then. And of course, the Vietnam War itself fits into all of this. Fast forwarding to today, we have a global resurgence of the far right, honest to God, farm-to-table fascism in Italy, right? Like regular, original stuff. A far-right movement in Brazil, though hopefully on the verge of defeat today.
Here.
Yep.
Fingers crossed. And of course, here in the United States. And that is being explicitly organized in a global sense by global multinational corporations, by political elites who are working in concert across borders, whether we're talking about Steve Bannon being down in Brazil or the Conservative Political Action Committee having their conference in Hungary, right? These are explicitly multinational forces, and they've always been. Borders are for people. They're not for capital. Capital has never respected them. And the kinds of political elites who are empowered by the capitalist system have never respected them either.
Could I pass it over to you, Bill?
Sure. I think that what Femi's saying is so interesting. You know, I've spent my life working on what in some ways is the first truly global issue that there's ever been.
Sure.
I mean, they don't call it global warming for nothing.
Right.
It's, you know, it affects everyone, but it's also not global in the sense that it's not caused by everyone.
Right.
And that's what makes it so interesting. One of the things that's been beautiful about the movement around it has been that we really have managed to make it's become a profoundly global movement with people everywhere joining in. I'll tell a story. I remember I'm not an organizer by background or training or anything. I'm a writer. And so, you know, entirely as we've done this organizing, we've been kind of making it up as we go along. But I started with some college students up in Vermont, this thing called 350.org, which became the first effort at a kind of global grassroots climate campaign. And I mean, it was hopelessly naive in a sense as it began. Literally, there were 7 college students who were starting it with me. There are 7 continents. Each one took one, you know, and we got to work. And our job was to find people like ourselves everywhere. And people said, well, you know, this isn't possible because environmentalism, concern about these things is a product, you know, it's rich white people who care about this and you'll never have any luck. I remember the day when we had coordinated our first global day of action. We were in New York, actually, to sort of bring it all together. And we'd asked people this was a little bit before Facebook. It would have been 2008. Our killer app was something called Flickr. And it allowed people to easily upload photographs. And so we were saying, as you're doing these demonstrations, put a picture up. So that we can share it around the world. And my job for the day was basically just monitoring. Well, it turned out that because it was a kind of unfilled niche, our organizing had been successful. We managed to have 5,200 simultaneous demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. But for me, it was remarkable watching this sea of images come in was that it took about 20 minutes to realize that pretty much almost all the people we were working with were poor, black, brown, Asian, young. Because that's what almost the whole world is in one of those categories or another, you know? And what do you know, they turned out to be exactly as interested in the future as any of us were, and maybe more so, because the future bears down very hard on you in place. So, you know, for me, that was a remarkable reminder of some of the things that Femi does for people who are involved in practical organizing. There's a chapter in Femi's book that's, I think, really useful in just trying to figure out about how to do work in a way that brings everybody in as much as you can without it being performative, along the way. That kind of inclusion as performance seems what you want is solidarity as as fact, and it's really been a great pleasure to kind of watch and get to work around the world building that, because we are, like it or not, at a deeply global moment. And I think what Femi said about the fact that though they love to talk about borders and immigration and how horrible it all is and whatever, in fact, capital continues to move easily across those borders. So at the moment, we're running this big campaign to take on the biggest banks in the world, Citi, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, which are also the biggest fossil fuel lenders in the world. They're basically taking all the capital that got built up in America over the last 100 years as it became the richest place in the world, and just recycling it, building oil pipelines, hither and yon. So it never slows down, and it really is important to be able to think on those kind of scales.
Thanks. I think that cues up the next question kind of about coalitions really nicely. You both emphasize the importance of collective and coalitional political action. I mean, both as an ethic and as an essential movement strategy. I mean, there's a principled element to it and a practical element as well. I mean, part of the story that you tell, Bill, is of the deleterious impact of the kind of hyper-individualism of the Reagan years and the attendant assault on the spaces and resources that were once at least nominally public, or at least nominally sort of held in common. And Femi, in turn, argues that, quote, coalitional politics, understood as struggle across difference, is simply politics. As you've both just said, we really need look no further than the Koch brothers' Americans for Prosperity Network or the Federalist Society or ALEC or whatever else to see that, the world's most reactionary forces, despite an apparent ideological, allergy to anything that sounds like collectivism, are highly organized and work in highly effective coalitions. So could you each kind of discuss the importance of coalitional organizing in your respective political work and speak to its role in tackling the kinds of crises that we're talking about here? Maybe we could start with you, Femi.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about this in the back room. And one of the things I think we all agreed on is I'm not sure any of us has ever met an individualist.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Really. Individualism is an effective rhetorical strategy, but in fact, the forces of capital and of empire have, from start to finish, allied across differences in order to subjugate everybody outside of the little club, and that is politics, right? For those of us outside of BlackRock and the Koch brothers, the rest of us who cannot afford to build billion-dollar bunkers in the event of climate and ecological collapse, I think what we have to do is figure out how to even the playing field between us and ourselves, and we can, measure in some ways how we're doing. I think since the 1990s, the top 10% in the United States have moved up to more than owning more than a third of the wealth of the total society, almost all driven by the top 1%. And those are the kind of numbers that make it look like a little bit of a long shot that there's going to be any kind of significant changes to society that are going to work in favor of everybody and not just the ultra-rich. But some more encouraging numbers are the numbers of union applications. I think if you have more union density and more organizations like workers' unions, that's one strategy for putting people together. But if you unified people who were debtors, then you could have debt strikes. If you unified people who were ratepayers for utilities, you could have rate-paying strikes. And all of these kinds of organizations, all of these ways of putting people together coalitionally, who have differences but have particular things in common: the workplace they're at, the debt that they owe, the energy bills that they pay. I think you start to have kinds of leverage that I think are more powerful ultimately than just relying on the ballot box. You know, you put all of those things together and you have what looks like a more effective movement, and the kind of thing that we've seen historically drives change of, you know, the revolutionary variety. So that's where my head is at, coalitionally speaking.
Well, I'll just tell the story of the work we're doing at the moment, which is trying to expand this coalition a little bit and bring new groups in, and it's fun work. And my wonderful colleague Veronique Graham is here. We've been working, part of a small crew that's worked over the last year to build out this new organization called Third Act that's aimed at people over the age of 60 like me for progressive organizing. Now, the theory for a long time was that this was useless work because people became more conservative as they aged, and this is definitely one of the things that progressives are not shy, but you always hear people going on and on about okay boomers and how good it'll be when everybody dies and we get onto, you know, some news or whatever. But we were convinced actually that this wasn't the case so much. That A, it was really important to try to do this because there's 70 million of us, and because we all vote, there's no known way to prevent old people from voting, and so we better try to bring them on side. And if you think about it, you know, we're not your grandparents' grandparents. If you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now, you were around for this period of epic social, cultural, political transformation. And if you don't believe it, look at all the things that the Supreme Court targeted this last session. It was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Clean Air Act of 1971, and Roe v. Wade 1973. So, you know, our sort of working slogan is, we won these fights once, we can win them again. And it's really been fun to try and bring, not as the sort of leaders, but especially on issues like climate or democracy, to bring people in, older people behind the remarkable young people that are at the forefront of the climate movement, of the new civil rights movement, of whatever it is. So I'll just end with an example of how this coalition stuff works in practice. We were doing a big demonstration not long ago outside one of these banks that we're mad at about their lending, a Chase Bank, and so there were hundreds of high school kids there, because the high school kids are all completely get it. Greta Thunberg's one of the great organizers that ever existed, and there are tens of thousands of Gretas scattered across the planet. So there were the high school kids, and they were a little sprier, so they were in the lead of the march. But at the back of the march, there was a crowd of us from Third Act with a big banner that said "Fossils against fossil fuels," and you know. So I'll just say, coalitional work is aided immensely by a certain amount of sense of humor and a little talent for self-deprecation. It makes everything much easier as one goes forward.
Well, thank you. I mean, along those same lines, I'm quite interested in the kinds of things that bind coalitions together, and you've both given some examples of possibilities. You know, one of the things that this brought to mind, Bill, you used the motifs of the flag, the cross, and the station wagon to structure your book and to sort of represent the constitutive elements of the story of a kind of white suburban prosperity here in the United States. And you show that, at least to some extent, you know, these are empty signifiers whose meaning is always contingent. The cross, for example, could just as easily call to mind radical liberatory traditions like Latin American liberation theology, as it could call to mind, you know, the evangelical movement that brought us Dobbs, among other things. You know, so for this very reason, you ask whether any of these symbols might, quote, be summoned up again to help us face a difficult future by repairing the damage they helped cause. So I wanted to start with you. I mean, in your experience, how can these sorts of symbols be mobilized for progressive social change, and then what are the risks of their misuse or abuse?
Well, let's just look around the room that we're in for a minute, because it's incredibly grand and remarkably beautiful, and a reminder that at least at certain points in our history, there's a series of symbols that carried extraordinary power and weight. I mean, think of the amount of effort that went into just making this room that we're in, and the sort of symbols and ideas and things that were behind it. I do think that in the case in particular of Christianity, the left made immediately surrendering the cross to the right as a symbol, I think, was a mistake. Because in my tradition, I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher. I mean, there are deeply, deeply radical and powerful parts of that gospel story. The idea that somehow a book about a guy who said you should sell everything you have and give it to the poor, who said turn the other cheek, who said we'd be measured by how well we took care of the naked and the hungry and the sick, that's been allowed to become the sole property of the right wing in this country, seems to me sad and a mistake. And as I say, I'm old enough to be very much in the kind of tradition of Dr. King and that understanding of the liberatory power. So, and in some ways, the same with the flag. This book of mine is about the suburbs, but it's also about a particular suburb that's in Lexington, Massachusetts, where I grew up, which was the first battle of the American Revolution. And when I was a boy, I was a tour guide on the battle green. I wore my tricorn hat and walked backwards around the battle green when I was in high school, giving tours to all the busloads of people who would come. And so I told the story 1,000 times of these local farmers coming together to enact what was, in some ways, the first big stand against colonialism and imperialism that we had in the world, Again, a really powerful story. Now, obviously, a deeply shadowed and nuanced one, too, and I write a lot about that in the book, particularly the racial history of the revolution and all that went after it. But again, not something I think that it was wise to just give up the kind of revolutionary and radical egalitarian, above all egalitarian tradition out of which America came. So I think symbols are important and worth fighting for, and the right sure believes that, because they've done everything they can to grab hold of those symbols and wage, and use them.
Well, so to turn the question back to you, Femi, I mean, the mechanism of the elite capture of identity politics isn't precisely the same as this kind of reactionary misappropriation of some of Bill's trinity of symbols, but I think there's at least a certain resonance there. So in the case of elite capture, I wanted to ask, what happens to the language of identity politics when it's torn from the distinctly coalitional, distinctly materialist roots of the Combahee River Collective and deployed instead in these kind of purely symbolic and performative terms?
I think it's interesting. I think Bill's answer actually helps answer this as well, because one of the things that we do with symbols is organize ourselves around them, right? So we stitch together the kind of people that are willing to do things with each other, like go to war, like build political campaigns. And in this kind of hyper-individual secular era, I think there's a way that we've started to talk about that as secondary or unimportant. And it really isn't. At the end of the day, we're not going to fight cops together because we like the same books, right? Like, I'm not gonna face prison or death for you because we prefer the same adjectives when we describe why the world is bad. You need a deeper personal, social, culturally bound connection with other people if you're going to do the things that social change requires, if we're going to do the things that the civil rights movement did in the 60s, right? And I think religion is a way that this countless times has actually been built, past and present. It doesn't have to be religious, but there does need to be something there. There does need to be something that explains why we care what's going on with other people. And we have to be vigilant against the power of our social structure to evacuate all of the terms and symbols and ways of thinking and ways of talking that we use to do that. I don't think this is a special, as I said before, I don't think that elite capture is a thing that happens to just identity politics, but in general, they take the symbols that we use to build this kind of connection with people. The system we're in takes the symbols that we use to build that kind of connection with people and plasters them everywhere, right? So we've talked about Dr. King a lot in this conversation, and so does the center, so does the right. I've seen people from like the Cato Institute quote Frederick Douglass as to why why there shouldn't be public schools or something, which is not Frederick Douglass's politics, but unfortunately, one of the powers that symbols don't have is the ability to decide how they're used and who uses them. So in an unequal society, the people with the most resources, the most dollars, the most media connections, have the most ability to get out whatever their version of the world is, whether it's a version of the world that Dr. King is saying that he loves capitalism in, or any other kind of misappropriation of identity politics. So, all of the things I just said, right? The importance of symbols, the importance of cultural connection, the importance of social connection. We're not going to be able to sustain those unless we build a kind of organizing structure, base building, if you've heard that term before, unless we have the kinds of places and organizations that sustain other ways of looking at the world, whether it's unions, whether it's political parties that are built around a more progressive way of looking at the world, but you need the kind of material organization and organizations that make it possible to keep telling the story of what Dr. King actually said, or keep telling the story of what anti-colonial history was about. That takes institutions, it takes places, it takes events like this, and it takes the organizations and people who will continually do those.
And
So-
if I can just
please.
add, I mean, it also, one of the things that we've got on our side here, given what Femi says is all of which is correct, you'd think we'd have no chance at all in these things. But in fact, to some degree or another, we hold our own, trying to, and one of the things that makes that possible that I've become more and more cognizant of is the fact that human creativity and art and music and things operate as one of these ways in which it's possible to, I've been thinking a lot about this as we've done this third act thing, because when young people come up and go on and on about OK Boomer and stuff, I always just smile and look. And then I sometimes will say, say what you will, though, our generation did produce the greatest music of all time. And it really is fun to have some of those iconic figures still around helping out. And the power of having, when we have one of these calls and suddenly there's Carole King or Neil Young or Bette Midler or whoever it is joining in, is a reminder that there's, that that the human spirit's made up more than our kind of material interests about things. And that's good, because that ability to appeal to whatever the best part in us is something we really should not let go of. And that comes in many ways, and art is one of them, I think. So
before we turn to a kind of brief Q&A, I wanted to bring us back down to kind of the nitty-gritty of the tactics and strategies that these movements we're discussing, ultimately need to deploy if they're going to be successful. A real challenge for anybody on the left, any movement on the left, is that you have to kind of make a double move. I mean, first you have to present a compelling and urgent critique. You have to show that something is wrong in the status quo, which takes some convincing a lot of the time. But then second, you also have to propose an alternative future that is appealing, that people want to fight for, and that people want to come, build solidarity around. Something that both of you have spoken about in your work is the concept of reparations. And in my view, reparations is an important kind of framework and also maybe tactic, because it accomplishes both of those things in a single move. It's both a critique and a potential solution. So I wanted to just hear your thoughts on reparations as a tangible approach to rectifying the damage wrought by this nexus of empire, slavery, and climate crisis that we've been getting at. And maybe beyond reparations, are there other sorts of tools that either of you feel our social movements have but need to deploy, or need to access that they don't yet have that would benefit them? So maybe we'll start with Femi and move back to Bill.
One of the things that I've said about reparations, one of the basic overarching way that I've tried to talk about it is, learning from generations of people who have pursued reparations in this way as a kind of vehicle for transformation and not just a sort of one-off acknowledgement of wrong things that happened in the past. You could call it the constructive view of reparations, but the basic idea is we're trying to build something with reparations, right? This double move. We're trying to not just acknowledge something in the past, but acknowledge it in a particular way. Reparations tells us to look back at yesterday's injustices, but we're doing that to figure out what justice looks like tomorrow, or at least in part to figure out what justice looks like tomorrow. And look, that's going to involve cash money. Like, this is not... Checks in the mail is a great idea, right? It's part of how this system works. It's just true that if you have less cash, you can do fewer things. That's how we have built the world. But is that how we want to leave the world? I think is a legitimate question. Is that the only thing that stands between us and what we want the world to look like? I don't think so. I think we should redistribute who has cash, but also who has power in the straightforward political sense. So things like energy democracy, or letting people control in democratic ways how energy is produced, rather than letting shareholders control whether or not people have lights and heat, also fits into how I think of reparations and fits into the larger world that I think we should be building with reparations. So, this kind of world-making perspective on what reparations is about is, I think, really valuable. And that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Femi's book on reparations, really important. I wrote some about it in the context that we normally think about it in this country as a kind of remedy for our race-based history here, but I also wrote about the other debt, the other huge debt that we owe, which is the debt that comes from having a country with 4% of the world's population put 25% of the carbon into the atmosphere. So if you're in Pakistan right now, there's 33 million people displaced from their homes. That's the population of Boston down to Baltimore out of their homes. really nobody in Pakistan did anything that caused the climate crisis. There's 200 million people there, give or take. They produced about 1% of all the carbon in the air. The entire continent of Africa, which is taking it on the chin from global warming right now, there's 20 million people in the Horn of Africa dealing with real potential literal starvation because it's the 5th straight rainy season without any rain. Well, the entire continent of Africa put 2% of all the greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So this demands reparations of some kind, and one of the big topics at the next UN climate conference in Egypt will be what's called loss and damage. And is there there's no question where justice falls on these things and where we should be working. There's also no question that in both cases, nationally and internationally, they're an incredibly hard political lift and super easy for the right wing to make as divisive and ugly a thing as possible. And so to go back to the original spirit of your question, we should be looking for things that are exciting and future illuminating. So literally one of those things right now is the fact that over the last decade, scientists have brought the cost of renewable energy down 90%. The cheapest way to generate power on planet Earth now is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. So that's an incredibly interesting change. And one of the things that we could and should be doing is figuring out how around this country and around the world to deploy that clean energy just as fast as we possibly can. Among other things, it allows people in places without access to much energy now access to it. It's clean so that people aren't dying from breathing particulates their whole lives. And it also, as Femi was saying, allows a new kind of democracy in relationship to one of the most important commodities that around us. Nobody, not Exxon, not Vladimir Putin, not the Koch brothers, is capable of interdicting the sun, and that makes it a much, that's a truly revolutionary idea that you'd have one of our basic commodities available to everybody on somewhat equal terms. That strikes me as a place where it's possible to imagine getting buy-in from a lot of places and people around a project that's in everybody's interest, but also represents some attempt to begin repaying what are essentially unrepayable scale of debts.
Well, Femi, Bill, thanks so much for such a wonderful conversation. I'd love to have a round of applause for our two panelists. So we have about 3 minutes for a Q&A. Maybe we could take 2 or 3 questions at once, and then the panelists can respond. So you back there, yep, you and you over there, and that might be as far as we can go. Yeah, and could we get your question as well, please, and then they can answer both of them. Yeah, yep. All right.
Well, I didn't say America was founded on egalitarianism. I said that I was talking about the Battle of Lexington at the beginning of the American Revolution, and I said that the Minutemen who stood up there were standing up to what was the biggest empire that the world, as Femi had said, was already the biggest empire the world had ever seen. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't incredible problems with American history, and in fact, that's what most of the book that I wrote is about. But I also think that, you know, you live in the world that you live in, and in that world, there's a country called the United States. There's 300 million of us. We better figure out how to make it a force for good in the world if we can, because because I don't, you know, I don't know what force is going to obliterate it or remove it from power. So it makes sense. Okay, but to me, our organizing, you know, and all work we do is to try and make it a place that can, that is more benign, both domestically and around the world, and that does not seem impossible to me.
So the question, I take it from me, was Anand Girihadis' book, Winner Take All, and what the relationship between that idea and the idea that I'm talking about in elite capture is. And I think it's very similar. I think we agree on a lot. I think, in particular, the idea that a lot of parts of the world are moving to a winner-take-all kind of economy. There are certain job markets that are like that, and maybe our political system is in general like that. I think that's quite similar to the idea of elite capture. But the difference is that, I mean, to the extent that there's a difference, my way of thinking about it is a little less tied to markets. But yeah, I think we pretty broadly agree. But I do want to say something about the question Bill fielded, which is, look, if we can tear this thing down, let's tear it down. But whether we do or not, the carbon that's in the air is in the air, right? And the questions about building a food system that serves everyone and that everyone has sovereignty over, especially the people who do the farm labor. The question of building an energy system that protects everyone, like those questions are questions where the existence or non-existence of this state in this form figures in as an obstacle, but tearing this thing down isn't an answer to those questions. And so I think we just have two sets of questions to answer, right? Like, how do we get this thing out of the way, and how do we build the thing that we actually want to live in?
Amen.
Thanks so much, everyone.
And thank you for very good questions, very thoughtful questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.